Zara Solaris stood on the observation deck of the Terran starship Prometheus, gazing out at the swirling iridescence of the Orion Nebula. The vast stellar nursery stretched across the viewport, a riot of color and light that never failed to steal her breath. But today, the nebula's beauty held little sway over Zara's thoughts. Her mind was consumed by the mission that had brought her to this remote sector on the fringes of Earth space, a mission of diplomacy. And, perhaps, humanity's last hope for survival. The swish of the observation deck doors jolted Zara from her musings. She turned to see her second-in-command, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Eli Vance. Eli's usually stoic features were shadowed with concern as he stepped to her side. "We've arrived at the rendezvous coordinates, Ambassador. But there's no sign of the Kressari delegation." Zara felt a prickle of unease. The Kressari were a technologically advanced species, one of the oldest and most influential in the galactic community. For them to be late to a meeting of such importance. "Are we certain these are the right coordinates?" she asked, striving to keep her voice level. Eli nodded grimly. "Triple-checked them myself. This is where the Kressari ambassador said to meet." Zara turned back to the viewport, worrying at her lower lip. The Kressari were known for their punctuality. If they hadn't arrived as scheduled, something was wrong, very wrong. She drew in a deep breath, squaring her shoulders beneath her diplomatic robes. "Contact the bridge. Tell them to initiate long-range scans. I want to know if there are any Kressari ships in the vicinity, right away." Ambassador Eli hurried from the observation deck to relay her orders, leaving Zara alone with the restless cadence of her own thoughts. For a moment, she let her facade of calm slip, the weight of her mission pressing down like a physical burden. So much was riding on this meeting. The fate of Earth, of the entire human race, hung in the balance. The sudden, urgent blare of the ship's alarms shattered her dark reverie. "Red alert," the voice of Captain Neera Singh crackled over the comm. "Ambassador Solaris to the bridge. We have a situation." Zara's blood ran cold. A red alert could only mean one thing: danger. She spun on her heel and sprinted for the bridge, heart pounding in time with her racing footsteps. The corridors of the Prometheus blurred past, crew members flattening themselves against the bulkheads to clear her path. As she burst onto the bridge, Zara's gaze flew to the viewscreen. What she saw there froze the breath in her lungs. A Kressari ship hung in space before them, its sleek silver hull pitted and scarred with the unmistakable marks of weapons fire. Gouts of atmosphere and sparking debris spilled from rents in its armored shell. Report, Zara snapped, fighting to master the fear that clawed at her throat. Captain Singh whirled to face her. The strain of the situation etched into every line of her face. The Kressari ship just dropped out of hyperspace. They're badly damaged and not responding to hails. A cold knot formed in Zara's gut. "Life signs." Singh shook her head, her expression grim. "Scanners aren't detecting any. But with that much damage, it's hard to be sure." Zara's mind raced, 1,000 possibilities swirling through her thoughts. An accident? A malfunction? Or something far more sinister? She drew in a steadying breath. "Hail them again. If there's anyone still alive over there, we need to." A brilliant flash seared the view screen, cutting off her words. Zara flung up a hand to shield her eyes as the bridge crew cried out in alarm. As the glare faded, Zara lowered her hand and felt her blood turn to ice in her veins. The Kressari ship was gone, reduced to a spreading cloud of debris, destroyed, and in its place. "New contacts," Singh's voice held a razor's edge of fear. "Multiple unknown vessels dropping out of hyperspace." There, her words trailed off as the strange ships fully resolved on the view screen. Zara stared, her heart stuttering in her chest. The ships were like nothing she had ever seen. Jagged, asymmetrical hulls bristled with strange protrusions and pulsing nodules that defied any semblance of known design. Their surfaces seemed to ripple and writhe like living flesh, shot through with oily iridescence, and they were massive. The smallest dwarfed the Prometheus, like a shark circling a minnow. What are they?" someone whispered, fear and awe stitched into every syllable. Zara swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly bone dry. "Unknown, but I think it's safe to say they're not friendly." As if in answer to her words, a shudder ran through the deck as the Prometheus shields absorbed the first salvo of alien weapons fire. "Evasive maneuvers," Singh barked, her voice cutting through the rising tide of panic on the bridge. Get us out of here. The Prometheus lurched as the helmsman flung the ship into a desperate corkscrew, weaving between searing lances of energy that scorched the void. Damage alarms shrieked as the alien barrage intensified, hammering at the ship's faltering defenses. Zara clung to a console, mind racing even as dread coiled in her gut. They had to escape, had to warn Earth. If these aliens had destroyed the Kressari delegation, another blast slammed into the Prometheus, hurling Zara to the deck. The lights flickered and died as main power failed, plunging the bridge into darkness. In the crimson wash of the emergency lighting, Zara hauled herself to her feet. Smoke choked the air, mingling with the moans of the wounded. The view screen was a spider's web of cracks, but through it, Zara could see the alien ships closing in for the kill. Ambassador, it was Eli, his face streaked with blood. We have to get you to an escape pod. If the Prometheus falls, you're our last hope of warning Earth. Zara shook her head stubbornly, though despair clawed at her heart. I can't abandon the ship. My place is here. With respect, Ambassador, your place is wherever you can do the most good for our people. Eli's voice softened. Right now, that's not here. Anguish twisted in Zara's chest. He was right. As much as it tore at her to leave her crew, her duty to Earth came first. Always. She reached out, gripping Eli's shoulder. Get as many of the crew to the pods as you can. I'll see you on the surface. Eli nodded, his jaw tight. Godspeed, Ambassador. Then he was gone, vanished into the smoke and chaos. Zara spared a final glance for the shattered bridge, committing every detail to memory. She would carry this moment, carry the weight of the lives entrusted to her, for all her remaining days, however few those might be. Zara turned and ran, following the pulsing emergency lights towards the escape pods. The deck shuddered and heaved beneath her feet as the Prometheus began to come apart, the screech of tearing metal filling the air. She flung herself into the first open pod, the hatch slamming shut behind her as she crashed into the acceleration seat. Her shaking hands flew over the unfamiliar controls, adrenaline and desperation driving her movements. The pod shuddered as the docking clamps released, hurling Zara out into the void. Through the tiny viewport, she caught a final glimpse of the Prometheus, wrapped in a corona aflame as the alien weapons savaged its hull. And silhouetted against that fiery backdrop, the alien vessels closed in like sharks scenting blood. Zara squeezed her eyes shut, hot tears tracing down her cheeks. Grief and horror warred within her, mingling with a sudden, terrible understanding. The Kressari delegation hadn't been late. They'd been destroyed, just like the Prometheus was being destroyed now. Humanity had been wrong. They weren't alone in the universe, and now it seemed they were at war. Zara's pod plunged towards the nearby planet, a blue-green marble swathed in clouds. She knew, deep in her bones, that it was only a matter of time before the alien ships followed, before they brought their terrible power to bear on an unsuspecting Earth, unless she found a way to stop them. Zara steeled her will as the pod screamed through the atmosphere, the hull glowing cherry red with the heat of re-entry. The burden of that terrible knowledge, of the horrors she had witnessed, settled on her shoulders like a leaden shroud. But beneath it, a spark of determination kindled. She was Zara Solaris, Ambassador of Earth, and she would not let her world burn, no matter the cost. The escape pod slammed into the ground in a billowing cloud of dirt and pulverized rock. Inside, Zara felt the bone-rattling impact in every joint as the crash webbing dug into her shoulders. For a long moment she simply hung there, ears ringing and head spinning. The air reeked of scorched insulation and lashings of smoke coiled in the tight confines of the pod. But she was alive. Miraculously, impossibly alive. With shaking fingers, Zara unlatched the crash webbing and slumped forward in the acceleration seat, sucking in a lungful of cool, blessedly smoke-free air from the cracked hatch. A small part of her wanted nothing more than to curl into a ball and shut out the horror of the last few hours, to close her eyes and wake to find it had all been some terrible nightmare. But she couldn't. Not with the smoke of the Prometheus death still clinging to her skin. Not with the weight of her crew's sacrifice heavy on her soul. They had died to buy her a chance. An infinitesimal, desperate chance to warn Earth of the coming storm. She would not let that sacrifice be in vain. Zara pushed to her feet, ignoring the protests of her battered body. Emergency training took over as she quickly assessed her surroundings through the cracked transparency of the hatch. The pod had come down in a small clearing, the crushed and blackened vegetation testament to the violence of the landing. Thick forest stretched in every direction, the trees tall and proud beneath an achingly blue sky. The air was breathable, the gravity only slightly heavier than Earth standard. If the situation had been any less dire, Zara might have taken a moment to marvel at the strange, alien beauty of this new world. But there was no time. Even now, the enemy ships could be descending through the atmosphere, homing in on her crash site. She had to move, had to find shelter and a way to contact Earth, assuming Earth was still there to contact. Zara pushed down the swell of fear and grief that rose in her throat at that thought. She couldn't afford to dwell on the enormity of what she'd witnessed, not if she wanted to keep putting one foot in front of the other. Survival and warning. Those were her priorities now. Everything else was secondary. She reached beneath her acceleration seat, pulling out the emergency pack stowed there. It was pitifully small, a few ration bars, a canteen, a compact med kit, and survival shelter. The locator beacon had been smashed in the landing. Not much to survive on an alien world. But it would have to be enough. Zara slung the pack over her shoulder and palmed the hatch release. The polymer cracked and flaked, damaged by the heat of re-entry, but after a few tries it grudgingly squealed open. Taking a deep breath of humid, earthy-smelling air, Zara clambered out of the pod. Her boots crunched on the scorched earth as she dropped to the ground, instinctively falling into a defensive crouch as she scanned the tree line for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the sigh of wind through the canopy and the distant trilling of some alien wildlife. Zara let out a slow breath. She knew better than to let her guard down, but the utter normalcy of her surroundings settled her jangling nerves just a fraction. This world, at least, seemed benign. A small mercy, but one she'd take. Shouldering her pack, Zara set out into the forest at a brisk clip. She had no way of knowing the Prometheus' final trajectory before it was destroyed, but she hoped that other escape pods had made it to the surface. If she could link up with other survivors, pool their supplies and knowledge. Behind her, the fading sun glinted off the battered hull of the escape pod. In a few more minutes, the shifting shadows of the forest had swallowed it from view, leaving only a faint trail of crushed vegetation to mark Zara's passage. The Ambassador of Earth glanced up, glimpsing the first cold glimmers of alien stars through the canopy. Drawing in a breath freighted with mingled grief and resolve, she pressed on into the gathering dusk, one step after another, towards an uncertain horizon. Darkness had fully fallen by the time Zara found a place to make camp. A shallow overhang of mossy stone, sheltered from the elements and defensible on three sides. Her aching muscles screamed protest as she shrugged off her pack and set about the familiar routine of survival, gathering wood, setting traps, checking her meager supplies. The tasks helped settle her mind, gave her battered psyche something to focus on, besides the yawning void of grief and loss. But even as her hands moved through the practice motions, Zara couldn't fully push away the memory of the Prometheus' final moments. The image of those alien ships, so implacably hostile and terrifyingly advanced, seemed seared into the back of her eyelids. What were they? Where had they come from? And more important, what did they want? The attack had been too swift, too brutal to be anything but deliberate. The Kressari delegation, the Prometheus, they hadn't been targets of opportunity. They'd been hunted down and destroyed, which meant the aliens, whoever or whatever they were at war with the Kressari, with humanity, with any species that might pose a threat. A shudder rippled through Zara that had nothing to do with the chill of the night. If that were true, this was just the opening salvo in a campaign of extermination. She squeezed her eyes shut, pushing down the swell of despair. She couldn't think like that. Couldn't let the enormity of what she faced overwhelm her. She had to hold on to hope, had to believe that there was still a chance, however slim, to warn Earth, to find a way to fight back. The alternative was too terrible to contemplate. Zara finished setting the last of her traps and ducked back under the overhang. The survival shelter was little more than a thin sheet of reflective polymer, but it would keep out the wind and rain, assuming this planet had rain. With a grimace, Zara pulled out one of the ration bars, a gritty, nutrient-dense slab that was only marginally more appealing than eating dirt and nibbled off a corner. She needed to keep her strength up, needed to be ready for whatever tomorrow brought. As she chewed, her gaze drifted to the star-flecked sky visible through the trees. The constellations were alien, the patterns unfamiliar ... but achingly beautiful in their strangeness. Somewhere out there, amid that glittering expanse was Earth, her home, her people, and between them, an enemy vast and merciless and utterly unknown. Zara swallowed past the sudden tightness in her throat. "I will find a way," she whispered to the uncaring stars. "I will warn you." It felt like an oath, a promise written in the silence and darkness, a flicker of defiance against the terrible odds, and deep within, something answered. A small, fierce flame kindling to life in her chest, the same flame that had driven her to the stars in the first place, that had forged her into the woman she was. The flame of human determination, of the unquenchable will to fight, to survive, to find a way through to dawn. Zara clung to that flame as she settled back against the cold stone, letting exhaustion drag her down into a restless sleep. In the morning, she would begin her search for the other survivors, for a way to contact Earth. In the morning, the fight would begin in earnest. But for now, Ambassador Zara Solaris dreamed of the blue-green marble of her home ... down the battle to come. The dawn came swathed in mist, and the trilling of unfamiliar birdsong. Zara woke with a start, hand instinctively flying to the small survival knife at her belt. For a disoriented moment, she couldn't place her surroundings, the damp stone at her back, the alien foliage crowding close. Then memory crashed over her like a frigid wave. The Prometheus. The attack. The desperate flight to the surface of this unknown world. Zara squeezed her eyes shut against the sudden swell of grief and horror. In the light of a new day, the events of the past 24 hours seemed even more surreal, more nightmarish. But nightmare or not, she couldn't afford to dwell on it. Couldn't let the enormity of her loss, of the threat facing her homeworld, paralyze her. She had a mission, a purpose, and she would see it through, no matter the cost. With a deep breath, Zara pushed to her feet, ignoring the protests of muscle stiff from a night on cold ground. She made a quick circuit of her small camp, checking the traps empty, but that was hardly surprising, and scanning the surrounding forest for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the sigh of wind through the canopy and the furtive rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. But Zara knew better than to let her guard down. This world might seem peaceful, even idyllic ... but she had no way of knowing what dangers lurked just out of sight, or what eyes might be watching. Pushing down a shutter, Zara broke camp with quick, efficient movements. She scattered the remains of her small fire, erasing any sign of her presence, and shouldered her pack. Then, with a last quick survey of her surroundings, she struck out into the misty forest. Her goal was simple: find other survivors, find a way to pool their knowledge and resources, and above all, find a way to warn Earth of the terrifying threat massing on its doorstep. Zara held to that goal like a talisman, as she pushed through the clinging undergrowth, senses straining for any sign of human presence. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, an endless expanse of towering trees and draped vines, broken only by the occasional rushing stream or moss-slick outcropping. By midday, Zara's fatigues were plastered to her skin with sweat, and her lungs burned with the effort of pushing through the dense foliage. But she refused to slow her pace, refused to give in to the exhaustion and despair nipping at her heels. She had to keep moving, had to find the other survivors. Every moment she delayed was a moment Earth remained ignorant and vulnerable. As the sun began its slow descent towards the horizon, Zara finally called a halt, slumping against the gnarled trunk of a massive tree. Her body ached with a bone-deep weariness and her stomach cramped with hunger, but those were secondary concerns. Far more pressing was the gnawing fear that she was the only one. The only survivor of the Prometheus destruction. The only human on an alien world, light years from home. Zara closed her eyes, fighting down a sudden swell of isolation and despair. She couldn't think like that, couldn't give in to hopelessness. The escape pods had launched. She had to believe that others had made it to the surface, just as she had. She just had to find them. Drawing in a shaky breath, Zara pushed away from the tree ... and froze. There, just at the edge of her hearing ... a muffled thump. Like the distant impact of a large object striking the earth. heart suddenly hammering. Zara cocked her head, straining to pinpoint the sound. It had been faint, barely audible over the ambient noise of the forest. But she was certain she hadn't imagined it. Another thump, slightly louder, closer, and then a third, and a fourth. Footsteps. Zara realized with a bolt of mingled hope and trepidation. Something large and bipedal, moving through the forest. Something ... or someone. Hardly daring to breathe, Zara slipped into the deeper shadows beneath the tree, one hand hovering near her survival knife. Every sense felt stretched to breaking, attuned to the approaching footfalls. Closer now. 30 meters. 20. Zara tensed, preparing to bolt or fight. Her mind raced, trying to anticipate what might come bursting through the screen of foliage. A survivor from the Prometheus, one of the enigmatic aliens, come to hunt her down. The footsteps reached the edge of the small clearing ... and a figure stepped into view. Zara's breath left her in a rush. Not an alien. Not a monster or a hostile native. A human. Wearing the tattered remains of a Terran diplomatic uniform, Zara breathed, almost dizzy with relief. At the sound of his name, Eli Vance whirled, hand flying to the makeshift club at his belt. For a moment, his eyes were wild, uncomprehending. Then recognition dawned and he sagged, the coiled tension draining from his frame. "Ambassador," he croaked, voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. "Thank the stars. I thought ... I feared." He trailed off, but Zara heard the unspoken words as clearly as if he'd shouted them. "I thought I was the only one." Swallowing hard, Zara stepped out from beneath the tree, closing the distance between them. Up close, she could see the toll the last day had taken on her second-in-command. His face was drawn and haggard, his uniform torn and stained with sweat and dirt. But his eyes ... his eyes blazed with the same fierce determination that had always marked him. The same indomitable will that had driven him to her side, to fight for the survival of their crew and their mission. "It's good to see you," Zara said softly, clasping his shoulder. "I feared the worst." Eli shook his head, a ghost of his old wry smile touching his lips. "Takes more than a few genocidal aliens to put me down, Ambassador. You should know that by now." Despite herself, despite the direness of their situation, Zara felt an answering smile tug at her mouth. "I should," at that. The moment of levity passed as quickly as it had come, reality reasserting itself. Zara stepped back, gaze turning serious. "The other?" she asked, steeling herself for the answer. Eli's jaw tightened. "I found a few other escape pods, mostly damaged beyond repair in the landing. A handful of survivors, in bad shape. I left Ensign Cho with them, trying to patch them up with what we have left of the medkits." He hesitated, pain flashing across his face. "The rest ... there are no other signals, no other traces." Zara closed her eyes briefly, grief a leaden weight in her chest. So few. Out of a crew of hundreds, only a tiny fraction accounted for. And the rest ... gone. Consigned to the void, to the cold and merciless dark. She drew in a shuddering breath, squaring her shoulders beneath the burden of command. She couldn't change what had happened, couldn't bring back the dead, but she could fight for the living. For the survivors huddled in the wreckage of their pods, wounded and afraid. For the billions of souls on Earth, unaware of the doom hurtling towards them. "Take me to them," she said, meeting Eli's gaze. "We need to consolidate our resources, figure out our next move." Eli nodded grimly. "This way. We've set up a temporary camp in a defensible position. It's not much, but it's the best we've got." He turned, preparing to lead the way back through the forest. But Zara caught his arm, a sudden thought striking her. "Wait. The pods ... Did any of the long-range comms survive the landing?" A spark of understanding kindled in Eli's eyes. "One. Badly damaged, but Ensign Cho thinks she can rig something with the parts from the other pods." And Zara felt a flicker of hope, bright and fierce amidst the darkness. A way to contact Earth, to warn them of the coming storm. It wasn't much. The barest flicker of a chance, but it was something. A lifeline, slender and fraying, cast out into the void, and Zara would grasp it with both hands. "All right," she said, squaring her shoulders. "Take me to this camp. We've got work to do." The survivors' camp was a ragged huddle of makeshift shelters clustered beneath a massive, overhanging cliff face. Zara counted barely a dozen huddled figures, some lying prone on salvage bedding, others moving listlessly among the shelters. Her heart clenched at the sight. So few, so fragile and battered against the vast alien wilderness pressing in on all sides. But as Eli led her into the camp, as heads began to turn and weary eyes kindled with recognition and hope, Zara felt that flicker of determination catch and hold. These were her people, her crew. And though they might be wounded, heartsick, and far from home, they were not beaten. Not while they still drew breath. Not while there was still a chance, however slim, to fight back against the darkness. Zara moved among them, clasping hands and offering words of encouragement. She listened to their stories of terrifying flights through the atmosphere, of hard landings and desperate scrambles for survival in the aftermath. And through it all, a single thread of defiance, a refusal to surrender, to let the horror of what they'd endured break them. They were Terran, to the last. And they would not go quietly into the night. At the center of the camp, Zara found Ensign hunched over a tangle of wires and components that might have once been a communications array. The young woman looked up as Zara approached, exhaustion and grim determination warring in her eyes. "Ambassador, I'm glad you made it." "Likewise." Ensign Zara crouched beside her, gaze sweeping over the gutted remains of the comms equipment. "What's our status?" Cho blew out a sharp breath. "Not good. The array took a beating in the landing. I've managed to cobble together a basic transmitter from the wreckage of the other pods, but..." She shook her head. "Without a signal booster or a high-gain antenna, the range is limited. A few light years, at most. Certainly not enough to reach Earth." Zara felt her heart sink, but refused to let despair take hold. "What about the Prometheus, if any part of the ship survived the attack?" "That was my thought as well." Cho met her gaze, a flicker of hope kindling in her eyes. "The Prometheus was equipped with a quantum entanglement communicator for emergency transmissions. If we can salvage the QC feed from the wreckage, we'd have a direct line to Earth." "A way to warn them," Zara finished, pulse quickening. It was a desperate long shot, but it was a chance. And right now, stranded on an alien world with an implacable enemy closing in, a chance was all they could ask for. Zara straightened, resolve crystallizing. "All right, we need to locate the Prometheus crash site, salvage that QC." She raised her voice, addressing the gathered survivors. "I won't lie to you. The odds are against us. We're hurt, cut off from support. But we're not helpless, and we're not alone." Zara met each battered, weary gaze in turn, willing them to feel the fire kindling within her. The unquenchable human spirit, the determination to endure against all odds. Somewhere out there, Earth is waiting. Our families, our homes. And they need us now more than ever. She drew in a breath, voice ringing with conviction. "We are the last line of defense. The only thing standing between humanity and the abyss. And we will not fail." The words hung in the air, a challenge and a promise. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, slowly at first, but with growing strength, a ragged cheer arose from the gathered survivors. A defiant roar, torn from throats raw with grief and exhaustion. But beneath it, Zara heard the unspoken vow. The same promise she'd made to herself in the darkest moments of the night. "We will find a way. We will warn Earth, and we will fight. To the last breath, and the last beat of our hearts, for we are Terran, and we do not surrender." The planet's sun was sinking towards the horizon by the time the ragged band of survivors set out from the camp, following the faint ion trail of the Prometheus death throes. Zara took point, Eli at her side, and Ensign Cho bringing up the rear with the few able-bodied crew members. The rest, the wounded, the exhausted, stayed behind, guarding the comms array and conserving their strength for the trials ahead. They moved in silence, saving their breath and their energy. The forest pressed close, dark and filled with the rustling of unseen creatures, but Zara refused to let the alien night unsettle her. They had faced worse, she and her crew, and they would face worse yet before this was over. At her side, Eli moved with grim purpose, his makeshift club held at the ready. His eyes continually scanned the deepening shadows, alert for any sign of threat. But it was Ensign Cho who broke the tense silence, her voice tight with strain over the whine of her hand scanner. "The ion trail is getting stronger. I think we're close." Zara felt her heart kick into a higher gear. Beside her, Eli's shoulders tightened fractionally. This was it. Their one desperate hope of warning Earth, of striking back against the enemy that had torn their world asunder. Zara motioned for the group to fan out, picking their way carefully through the dense undergrowth. She strained her senses, searching for any sign of the downed starship. And then she saw it. A glint of metal through the trees, a shape too regular to be natural. There she breathed, pointing. As one, the group crept forward, emerging from the tree lying into a scene of utter devastation. The Prometheus lay like a gutted beast, her once sleek hull ripped open and strewn across a vast swath of blasted earth. Gouts of flame still flickered in the wreckage, casting an eerie orange glow over the twisted metal. And everywhere, the detritus of shattered lives. Fragments of bulkhead, the sad remnants of crew quarters. A scrap of fabric that might have once been a uniform sleeve. Zara swallowed hard against the sudden tightness in her throat. This was her ship, her home for the last 5 years. The place where she'd lived and worked alongside a crew that had become like family, and now it was a tomb. A shattered husk, monument to the lives lost and the battles yet to come. At her side, Eli drew in a shuddering breath. "My God," Zara placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the tremor that ran through him. They were all shaken, all grieving. But they couldn't afford to break. "Not now. Come on," she said softly. "We need to find that QSE." Eli met her gaze, and in his eyes Zara saw the same resolve that burned in her own heart. The determination to see this through, no matter the cost. Together, the small group picked their way into the wreckage of the Prometheus, stepping carefully over jagged metal and sparking wires. The ship groaned and settled around them, the tortured metal sounding almost like a living thing in its final agony. At the rear of the group, Ensign Cho played her scanner over the debris. The QC should be housed in a reinforced compartment near the engineering section. If anything could have survived the crash. She trailed off, but the unspoken hope hung in the air between them. Zara took the lead, clambering over a collapsed bulkhead. The corridors were dark and choked with debris, the emergency lighting long since failed. She relied on memory and instinct to guide her, retracing the once familiar path to engineering. Behind her, the others followed in grim silence. The only sounds were the creak of settling metal and the rasp of their breathing in the confined space. And then, up ahead, a faint glow. The telltale shimmer of a containment field, still clinging stubbornly to life. Zara's heart leapt into her throat. She picked up her pace, scrambling over the last heaps of rubble. And there, nestled in a cradle of twisted metal, the QC. Eli breathed, something like reverence in his voice. It was battered, scuffed with soot and grime, but it was intact, a sleek cylinder no larger than a briefcase, its quantum heart still pulsing with an ethereal blue light. Zara reached out, hardly daring to breathe. Her fingers brushed the casing, feeling the faint drum of power within. "We found it," she whispered, wonder and relief warring in her chest. "We actually found it." Behind her, Ensign Cho let out a shaky laugh. Never underestimate Terran engineering. Eli stepped forward, shouldering his makeshift club. "Let's get it back to camp. We've got a message to send." Zara nodded, fighting back the sudden sting of tears. They had done it. Against all odds, they had found the key to Earth's salvation. Now, the real fight could begin. The hike back to the camp passed in a blur, Zara's mind whirling with plans and contingencies. The QC changed everything. With a direct line to Earth, they could rally the forces of humanity, coordinate a defense against the oncoming storm. But even as hope kindled in her chest, Zara couldn't shake the gnawing uncertainty. The enemy they faced was still largely unknown, their capabilities and intentions a mystery, and the Prometheus and the Kressari delegation had been destroyed so swiftly, so easily. What chance did Earth stand against such overwhelming power? Zara pushed down the treacherous thought. They had to try. Whatever the odds, whatever the cost, they had to stand and fight. Failure was not an option. As they approached the camp, Zara saw that the survivors had not been idle in their absence. Makeshift fortifications had been erected around the perimeter, fashioned from fallen trees and salvaged metal. Crude but effective watchtowers loomed at the corners, manned by grim-faced crew members armed with sharpened stakes and lengths of pipe. It was a far cry from the gleaming bulwarks of the Prometheus, but it stirred Zara's heart to see it nonetheless. The indomitable human spirit, the refusal to surrender. It burned bright in the eyes of every ragged defender. Eli let out a low whistle as they passed through the gate. They've been busy. Never underestimate a Terran with their back against the wall, Zara murmured, a flicker of pride momentarily eclipsing her worry. At the center of the camp, Ensign Cho immediately set to work integrating the QC into the jury-rigged comms array. Her face was drawn with exhaustion, but her hands were steady as she spliced wires and rerouted power from the salvage generator. Zara watched, hardly daring to breathe. So much rode on this moment. The fate of Earth, of the human race itself. And then, with a crackle of static and a hum of building power. The array lit up like a beacon in the night. Contact, Cho breathed, something like awe in her voice. Her fingers flew over the makeshift controls, locking onto Earth's coordinates. Transmitting on all emergency frequencies. The camp fell silent, every eye fixed on the comms array. For a long moment there was nothing but the hiss of white noise, the held breath of desperate hope. And then ... This is Terran command. We read you, Prometheus. What is your situation? The voice crackled with static, but it was undeniably human. Undeniably Earther. In that moment, it was the most beautiful sound Zara had ever heard. Blinking back sudden tears, she leaned forward and keyed the mic. Terran command. This is Ambassador Zara Solaris. We have a situation. The next hours passed in a blur of frantic activity and desperate transmission. Zara relayed all they had learned about the alien threat, the destruction of the Kressari delegation and the Prometheus. She downloaded the sensor logs and telemetry readings, praying they would give Earth some clue to the nature of their enemy. Through it all, the voice on the other end of the transmission remained steady, betraying no hint of the shock and horror Zara knew must be gripping Terran command. They were soldiers, trained to face the unthinkable with steely resolve. But Zara could read between the lines, could hear the grim understanding in every clipped acknowledgement, every terse instruction. Earth was mobilizing for war. Even now, the fleets were being recalled, the armies mustered, every ship, every soldier ... on into the desperate bid for survival against an enemy that had already proven terrifyingly superior. It was a bleak prospect. A future filled with fire and darkness and the dying of worlds, but it was a future. And Zara would fight for it with every fiber of her being. As the transmission ended, and the comms array powered down, Zara slumped back in her seat, suddenly feeling the weight of exhaustion like a physical thing. Every limb trembled with fatigue, every breath burned in her lungs. But beneath it all, a flicker of something fierce and unbreakable. The same light she saw kindling in the eyes of her crew as they looked to her for guidance, for hope, the light of the human spirit. Unbowed and unbroken, even in the face of annihilation. Drawing in a steadying breath, Zara pushed to her feet. There was still work to be done. Still battles to be fought, both on this alien world and in the stars beyond. Earth knew of the threat now. They were forewarned, if not forearmed. And Zara and her band of survivors had played their part in that vital first step, but their fight was far from over. Even now, the enemy could be closing in, drawn by the pulse of the QC transmission. They had to be ready, had to stand firm against whatever horrors the darkness brought to their doorstep. And so Zara moved among her people, bolstering spirits and shoring up defenses. She oversaw the rationing of supplies, the training of those able to fight. She pored over the sensor data, looking for any scrap of intel that might give them an edge. And through it all, she held on to that flicker of defiant hope. That unquenchable human will to endure, to find a way through to the light. For she knew with a bone-deep certainty that this was only the beginning. The first shot in a war that would shake the very foundations of the galaxy. A war that would test the mettle of every man, woman, and child who called Earth home. But as she looked out over the sea of determined faces, The ramshackle but unbroken survivors of the Prometheus Zara knew that metal would not be found wanting, for they were human, and they would not go gently into the long night. They would rage, they would fight, and they would endure no matter the cost, for in the end, that was the very essence of what it meant to be Terran. To stand tall in the face of the abyss, armed with nothing but grit and genius and the indomitable will to survive. It was a spirit that had carried them to the stars, thatched conquered worlds, and built wonders. A spirit that even now, bloody but unbroken, burned bright in the hearts of every soul who called Earth home. And it was that spirit that would see them through the darkness to come, through the long night and the desperate battles, through the blood and the fire and the grief, to a new dawn. A dawn bought with sacrifice and valor, with the lives and hopes of the fallen. A dawn that, no matter how distant, how unimaginable was worth fighting for, worth dying for. And as Zara stood beneath the alien stars, watching the campfires flicker in the darkness, and listening to the soft murmur of voices raised in quiet defiance, she knew that fight would never end. Not while a single human drew breath. Not while the embers of their resolve still smoldered, ready to be stoked to roaring flame. The Terrans had come to this nameless world as castaways, broken and lost, but they would leave as soldiers, as warriors baptized in the fire of a cause greater than any one life. They would leave as the spark of a battle that would light the stars and shake the universe to its very foundations. And may the gods have mercy on anything that stood in their way, for Earth was coming. Battered but unbroken, bloodied but unbowed, and the Terrans would not stop, would not rest until the night was banished and the dawn secure, no matter the cost, no matter the odds. Earth remembered, and Earth was coming.